Okay, moving on to where consciousness is in the brain. So we're going to review some of the neuroscience chapter from chapter 4. So remember when we talked about the brainstem? So this is the structure here that has kind of 3 main colored components. And we talked about this pons, this bridge in the middle, this blue structure. So this structure is in charge of sleep and arousal, which you might recognize as being one of the key factors of consciousness, that variation in alertness, those sleep-wake kind of cycles. A lot of that happens in the pons. There's also another key thing that runs across the brainstem, and this is what's called the reticular formation. You can see it, I believe it's this giant kind of red splotch in this diagram here. But this this part of the brainstem is primarily known for wakefulness as well. Fun fact, when you sustain a really high impact head injury, so for instance, if you're playing football and you get a really hard tackle, the reticular formation in the back of your head and the brainstem take a really big hit, which is why you often have these high impact injuries lead to a loss of consciousness and concussion. And it's why you've probably heard you shouldn't fall asleep after getting a concussion, because the reticular formation, which is in charge of wakefulness and its feedback loops, get damaged. So being able to wake you back up might be a little harder. Now, again, that science is still out, but that's one of the reasons they say that. So first spot in the brain you might see consciousness are the brainstem, because this is in charge of arousing you, waking you up, sleep-wake cycles, that kind of thing. Second area, you remember this analogy of Hallanamus? So the next major structure that's believed to be involved in consciousness is the thalamus, which, if you recall, is in charge of bringing sensory information from the environment to the cortex, right? So we briefly touched on how this works a little bit in the last chapter on sensation and perception. We've talked about how the lateral geniculate nucleus in the thalamus is involved in the vision pathway. In fact, most sensory systems have these kind of critical relay nuclei in the thalamus, and they're part of these connection loops to bring the outside information into the cortex. So if you think about it, if one of the things involving consciousness is this sensation of the external environment, being able to be aware of these sensations, then it makes sense that the thalamus, which brings in those sensations, is a key component of this process. So if you have some lesion studies have shown that if you lesion the thalamus or have damage to your thalamus, that leads to a loss of this sensory awareness of your external environment, and therefore a loss of consciousness. Third region now, the last one we're going to talk about that plays a role in consciousness is the general cerebral cortex, so your cortical lobes. And specifically the sections that are highlighted here, which are part of what we call the default mode network, or DMN. So this network is active during unconscious background activity. They call it your default kind of resting behavior. So when you're not doing any other task, this network is active the most. So it's active a lot in mind wandering, thinking about things, retrieving memories, just kind of generally being internally focused, right? So this network, as you can kind of see on the left brain diagram here, includes areas of the medial prefrontal cortex. We talked about the prefrontal cortex being involved in a lot of those kind of judgments and decision-making, the complex cognitive actions, as well as the posterior cingulate cortex. We talked about that being involved in some memory and some internal vision processing. And then also 2 subcortical structures. So we see the amygdala right here. Remember Amy the almond? So she's good at recognizing emotions and feeling processes of fear in particular. And then lastly, this seahorse-shaped hippocampus. So again, a memory kind of structure. So the reason we call this a network is because all of these regions tend to be active. We talked about fMRI tasks where you can see what brain regions are active. So these regions tend to be active all at similar times. So they must be kind of related in some way. Networks are kind of like cliques in high school. So they're really interconnected, and they don't really connect as much with things outside their cliques, right? So this network is kind of known for being some of that internal self-awareness and awareness of internal sensations associated with consciousness. So just to summarize that up one more time, you have three main components of consciousness: awake, aware, and self-aware. And they kind of map on to the three brain regions associated with consciousness: your brainstem for alertness, your thalamus for awareness of external sensation, and your cortex, or specifically the default mode network, for those internal self-awareness types of factors.